Thank you for the Martin. So good afternoon, and thank you very for the invitation. What I'm going to tell you is just the supporting act of what Martin has told and what is about to come, especially by Ludger Hobestadt and Wahid Musavi. I'm eager to hear what they have to tell, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. I'll try. So the title of my presentation is Architecture and Artificial Intelligence. In the foreword of his sixth book, Vitruvius tells the story of the pre-Socratic philosopher Aristippus of Cyrene, who was shipwrecked off the desert island of Rhodes and driven ashore. Though he didn't know where he was, he soon realized that this place had to be inhabited by humans. Geometric figures were drawn in the sand. Unmistakably, the traces of civilized people. Equipped with this knowledge, Aristippus set off for Rhodes to rush straight into the gymnasium, where he took part in the philosophical debates, just like we also would do. Daniele Barbaro, Venetian architect and above all, translator and commentator of Vitruvius, later remarked on this story that figures like those on the beach were rather the indisputable signs of higher thought. A footprint would have signified a human, but a triangle signified a mind. You can see the triangle below. Once again, I tell another story. Ulysses runs ashore, not a long time before Christ, but this time many years into the future. Not on a foreign coast, but on an alien planet. The protagonist, Ulysse Meru, has been shipwrecked on the planet of the apes. The apes consider humans as we usually consider animals. Some may possess intelligence, but are not endowed with much of a faculty of reason. Ulysse is captured and locked in a cage awaiting scientific research. Only after many long weeks does Ulysse find a way to convince Zyra, one of the research apes, and I put a picture here, of his intelligence. Why hadn't I already used this simple means of communication? I recalled my school days and drew the geometric figure that illustrates Pythagoras' theorem. Now the dam is broken. Suddenly she was the one who urged me to contact her. Secretly, I thanked Pythagoras and enjoyed geometry a little bit. On one side of the booklet, I drew, as best as I could, the three conic sections with the axis and the focal points, an ellipse, a parabola, and a hyperbola. Then I drew a cone on the opposite side. As is well known, these three conic sections result depending on the position of the cut planes in relation to the cone axis. Now I demonstrated how an ellipse is created and pointed with my finger to the corresponding figure in my first drawing. The chimpanzee was amazed. She tore the handle from my hands, drew a cone with another cutting plane, and pointed to the hyperbola with her long finger. I was so moved that tears came to my eyes and I clasped Zyra's hand. Ulysses, the French spaceman of the future, has succeeded. Not by some usual means of communication, not by learning a language, as in another science fiction. And I'm showing these pictures of the planet of the apes because this part is definitely not in the movies. Yeah? Okay, so not by learning a language as in Arrival, and not by conveying a culturally conventional meaning, which might be stored in the unthinkable memory of mankind, but surely not in that of the apes. Rather, it was the mediation of geometric abstract structures, a basis not of ours, but of the laws of nature. They do not come about through the agreement of like-minded people. Rather, they are objective in a genuine sense. They always work. The truth content is demonstrable. Demonstrable? I don't know. Thus, even here, when nature and culture meet under inverted relations, ape nature, man culture, usually they remain the pivotal point of a communication that is first of all one thing, a form of translation. That's interesting. When Barbaro, through Aristippus, deduces the presence of mind from the geometric figures in the sand, and Zyra, the ape, deduces from a conic section the presence of mind, then it cannot actually be that of mankind alone. Man is not present at the drawn figures on the coast of Rhodes. Neither a certain explanation nor the presence of humans is necessary. The figures and drawings act by themselves. Plans in architecture are not different. They enable the transfer of ideas from the planners to the people realizing the construction. The presence of the architect is not required. Even if there are pragmatic reasons for it, anyone who can read plans should at least know that what is meant by the drawings. The church of Saint-Pierre-in-Firminy by Le Corbusier, for example, whose construction began in 1970, was not completed until 41 years after the death of the architect, more or less according to the plans. There have been some changes. These plans also draw a simple geometric figure. The interior is formed by a square base that tapers upwards into a circle, at least in the initial version. Daylight enters through light boxes and through a series of well-placed openings that have a direct relation to the constellation of Orion. And by the way, that's where Ulysse went. The light boxes are designed so that on certain holidays, such as Good Friday and Easter Sunday, the altar is lit by the sun. The architecture functions here as a cosmic measuring instrument that reacts with precision to the high holidays, and it's by far not the only church that does that. However, not every form of precision is necessary in order to be precise. The frontispiece by Michael Burgess certainly shows one thing wrongly. What distinguishes geometric constructions is that they do not necessarily have to be drawn precisely in order to be correct. They do not need fixed quantities and numbers, but often deal with relations. The modern meter as an exact measure of length was not introduced until 1797. But what did geometry measure before? Plato's Menon, and now we are closer to the gnomon. Plato's Menon contains a demonstrative passage in which an ignorant servant reconstructs the diagonal of the square by remembering it under the guidance of Socrates. In conversation with his pupil Meno, Socrates calls a young servant and draws a square in the sand. First, he makes sure that the boy knows that the doubling from one side of the square doubles its area, and if the other side too is doubled, the initial area quadruples. The boy also understands that doubling this square, of which a side length of 2 feet is assumed, results in an area of 8 feet. However, the boy cannot answer the question of how large the edge length of the square must be in order to result in a square twice as large with a total area of 8 feet. First, he tries it with a length of 4 feet. That gives an area of 16. Then he assumes a length of 3 feet. That makes an area of 9. Socrates demands of him a measure. The servant thinks in quantities. Socrates now restates his question. The boy should no longer start from the sides of the square, but from its diagonals. Now he understands how to get a square with the area of 8 feet. One multiplies those triangles which result from the diagonal division of the square. A triangle forms half of the square. But if you put 4 such triangles together, you get double the area, 8 feet. The servant was limited in his thinking by calculating in whole numbers and by the arithmetic of multiplication tables, which produce only natural numbers. It was only by thinking in geometric terms and thus switching from quantitative to qualitative terms that he was able to answer Socrates' question correctly. In the algebra of the Pythagoreans, only whole or rational numbers existed, but not a triangle with its irrational, therefore innumerable hypotenuse. Aristippus is not the only one rushing directly from geometry to philosophy. Another one, again a Frenchman, refers like no other to the implications of the dialogue in the Menon and to the evidence it contains. There is no demonstration before the Greeks, Michel Serres says. None before the apagogical proof, before geometry, before the irrational. If you prefer not to make calculations, then show. This is an original sentence, he says. For Serres, the area makes things, length, visible, which the calculation could not capture. The proof and the apagogical proof demonstrates that numbers make things impossible, that the surface makes possible as a matter of course. Another method which Serres refers to is the one used by Thales of Miletus to determine the height of the pyramids, as Martin has already shown. And this without climbing the sacred tomb of the pharaoh or touching it in any way. He used a mediator, a stick. My graphic is not as mathematically inspired as yours. So a mediator, a stick whose shadow at a certain moment of the day was as long as the stick itself. Measuring the shadow of the pyramid at the same time, he could then tell how high it was. Of course, the ancient Egyptians were also able to calculate the height of the pyramids. But what Thales demonstrated, here above all, is the geometric similarity between the stick and the pyramid, between a length that is known and one that has to be found out. They are homothetic, because they have a common point of agreement, the sun, which in this case allows a translation from one object to another. Thales thus measures the relationship between the length of the shadows and at the same time invents the homothetia, and thus also the scaling and the scale. Serres designates both the side of the square from which Menon's servant proceeds in his calculations and the staff, the stick used by Thales, as gnomon. The term actually refers to the rod that casts the shadow on sundials from which the time of day can be read. Originally, however, and for a very long time, this rod was used to determine the geographical latitude of a place, as you also can see in on this style. The northern direction, the equinoxes, the solstices, and the ecliptic. It was therefore primarily not a clock, but an astronomical instrument. It is also possible that it was initially only used to record noonday and was therefore only used at a certain moment of the day. It remains to be seen what the parallel is with the measurement of Thales, who also carried it out at a certain point in time. Whether this was possible at a certain time of the day or only on a particular day of the year. In any case, Serres expands the term to designate tools that can be used to perform measurements within certain limits. Whole numbers in the case of a servant whose gnomon is the side of the square, and a certain position of the sun for Thales, whose gnomon is the rod. This list could be extended at will. Examples by Serres himself are the gnomonic numbers of Theon of Smyrna or the Pascal triangle. Both are mathematical methods that are used to determine ongoing numbers. Euclid, in turn, denoted in his Elements an L-shaped figure as a gnomon, and by this means the geometric abstraction of the right-angled Carpenter's angle of the same name. Called équerre in French, the relationship to the square, carré, and the sundial, cadran, is still present. Thus, instruments that originally drew the stations of the sun in the sand become tools that serve to depict abstract geometric figures. The simple carpenter's square is replaced in geometry by the construction tools, compass, and ruler. The latter comes from the Latin term regula, from rectus, the straight line, and at the same time also designates a rule. And the latter is what it's about, because with objects like these certain rules are set that allow or even dictate procedures. How should one define the gnomon differently, asks Serre, than as the law of a series? The gnomon is defined as a law of construction, he says, as the rule of a sequence or its engendering, an automatic rule functioning all by itself. As a consequence, it only offers a limited set of possibilities. The servant calculates in his head, thinks in tables, and remembers the multiplication tables. For Socrates in his school, this traditional tabular knowledge amounts to ignorance. Socrates, the philosopher who says he does not know, helps the servant to remember another knowledge and thus to free himself from his stencil-like tools of thought by leading him step by step, systematically and methodically to the new abstract world of geometry. A different thinking, knowledge. Hello? Yeah. A different knowledge. After release, is already the second person by geometry. I might have to change. Yeah. Oh, does it work? Yes. Great. So the gnomon says functions all by itself without any human intervention, like an artificial memory or an automaton. The gnomon is thus intelligent, Serre says, in the literal sense of the word, since he puts together situations selected from thousands of others and thus discerns and understands. An artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence doesn't date from yesterday, Serre emphasizes. You named the date like 2000 and something years. From the origin of science, there have existed things or states of affairs that the history of our languages has attributed to mental activities, as if these artifacts like plumb line, ruler or compass, framing square, passed for subjects of thought. For Serre, therefore, there is not only the recognizing subject, but also the intelligent artifact. His artificial intelligence stands for him independently next to what we commonly call intelligence when it is conceived as an ability that, at least until recently, was ascribed to humankind exclusively. This realization also affects our language, which lives inside us as well as outside us. We, its artisan, often find ourselves in a situation where we are led by this language. In other words, language is also an artificial intelligence, and Serre names more. But maybe more important, he says, to name three automatisms by an identical name, that of the stake raised towards the sun, that of the framing square or the lateral band that's added or subtracted, operation whose iteration constructs series of numbers, leads us to artificial intelligence. We see their avatars in these three states. First, a thing, post, or axis, a speculative tool, then as a ruler, then that will at leisure reproduce straight lines, angles, ideal polygons, which are extracted from this rule, or better still, abstracted from it. And finally, as a formal operation on numbers, an automatic rule, an algorithm. So Serre identifies things, artifacts, rules, and mathematical tools that think with, for, and besides us. Perhaps the surprising thing is this artificial intelligence not only in the algorithm-based technology of our days, but already in the ancient and simple artifacts whose sediments he detects in language and whose traces lead to epistemology and philosophy. The undeniable signs of higher thinking that Daniele Barbaro recognizes in the figures Aristippus encounters on the beaches of Rhodes are perhaps not only those of man. Man-made, they are. But things that act on their own like automatons. The Greeks were famous for their skills and resourcefulness, and so Serre notes that they invented a trick of the mind, the ruse mathematics. They gave us systems and schemata that were so different from each other that, taking the Greeks at their word, we arrange them along a linear evolution. As an example, Serre cites two different political orders by means of which the historian Jean-Pierre Vernant traces the revolutionary changes in Greek culture. The forerunner is the strictly hierarchical organization of the archaic world, vertically organized and pyramid-shaped, with the ruler at the head. Innovative the Greeks who organize themselves horizontally. They line up in a circle, and those who want to speak to the group stand in the middle, surrounded by their listeners. The hierarchy flattens out, with which the Greeks realized their famous isonomy, the democratic equality of rights. But it is not only society that organizes itself in a circular fashion. The same geometric figure also structures a new worldview, one that is no longer mythical and religious, but rational and geometric. Just like society, the cosmos is also organized, thus losing its original gradual structure. In the old order, the gods are above, mortals in the middle, the demons and other infernal beings below. In the new geometric order, the cosmos loses its composition. It becomes a place that has neither a floor nor ceiling, neither cellar nor attic, and thus loses its fascinating quality as a phenomenological habitat. Instead, indifference now prevails on the basis of equivalence through symmetry. But it's not as simple as Vernant claims, Serre replies. Basically, if one considers the archaic as an elevation and the Greek as a plan view, the two schemata are connected with each other. It is the same model, equally symmetrical and organized according to the same plan, the only difference being the mode of projection, which is rotated by a quarter. The difference between the two, Serre says, has exclusively to do with the observer's point of view. It is true that the Greeks disclose in the agora those matters that concern the city, which suggests a desacralization and rationalization of political life. The discussions in the agora are based on the circular assembly with a speaker in the center and listeners on the periphery. At the end of his presentation, the speaker leaves the center and moves to the edge, while a new speaker moves from the edge to the center. Due to this symmetry and interchangeability, all are equal. The archaic city, on the other hand, is organized hierarchically, with the king at the head who dominates the ruling class, which in turn dominates the submissive people. However, even in Greek society, this equality applies only to the aristocracy. It is superior to the rest of the city, it forms a closed circle, and thus excludes all others. The hate reverts into distance, which basically remains the same regardless of whether it is vertically or horizontally oriented. What counts is the relationship to the center, to the pole, or the axis. The relationship of forces formerly embodied by dominance, hate, and severity is transformed into the concept of relationship from the reference to the point of reference, as in a geometric representation. The hierarchy also remains in rational thinking, but there it becomes transparent and invisible, says Serre. In the moment we think rationally, we turn towards the center, a reference system, an arche. The essential thing for the whole affair, he says, remains the law of projective transformation, that quarter turn that makes one believe in democracy. And there are three, so Serre identifies this in society, in the cosmos, and in religion. So the big difference between the archaic and Greek ideas is not due to the principle of organization, but to the point of view of the observer. It's something different whether you look at something in elevation or in plan view. Both depict the same model, but nobody sees, according to Serre, neither the world nor society as if they were looking at it from above. This position is above the king, it is that of the mind. In this way, things can be viewed from outside of the world. Now the universe can be thought of outside it. Already the practice of this drawing proves the existence of another world. The Greeks invent in this way, and Serre now sees this as the big cut, theory, a stage of vision, theoros meaning spectator. They invent representation, and from this vantage point, the world can be seen as a spectacle, as a theater. The Greeks' production is projection, he ends, and the optimization of a projecting side, the flyover from on high or from outside the world. It took a while to get back to architecture, so I'm switching to the next picture, in which much of what has been mentioned above can be found. The projection, the observation from above, which leads Le Corbusier to remark that everything starts from the plan view. Le plan est le générateur, the plan is the generator, he says, 1923 in Vers une architecture. And perhaps architecture used the potential that the Greeks had discovered so early, only so much later. While an architect such as Étienne Louis Boullé, whom Le Corbusier admired, could not help but admire the sublime effect of his own architecture des ombres and architecture ensevelie. The above is more ombre and the below is more enseveli. Ink drawing is for him the appropriate way of depicting the monumental effect of light and shadow for his cenotaph for Newton, for instance. So the power of architecture is later relocated into the ground plan, which is decomposed and analyzed as diagrams, not least by protagonists such as Rudolf Wittkower, Bill Hillier, and Michel Foucault, just showing it as examples. They are always on the plan view. The comprehensible, visible, and symbolic effect of a representative architecture is transferred into the sober, ornamentless ground plan, objectified and thus made quasi-invisible. Although August Schmarsow considered architecture as a kind of space designer, Raumgestalterin he calls it, and characterizes the history of architecture as a history of the sentiment of space, Raumgefühl, in which a history of worldviews was displayed, and the concept of architecture as an actual spatial art has persisted since, there has always been a clear conceptual separation between plan view and elevation. The representative character of architecture is manifest in the elevation, the organizational one in the ground plan. And if the difference between archaic and Greek worldviews is based only on a simple twist from the outline to the ground plan, it is astonishing that in architecture the connection between these two forms of representation, so frontal view and plan view, is still an absolute rarity in the 15th century. That's truly remarkable. Throughout the Middle Ages, a system of proportions inherent in every object was sufficient to the object from the ground plan. Such a system required a very codified architecture whose proportions were extraordinarily repetitive. This was made possible by squaring, a system of doubling the area of the square by means of the diagonal, of course, which, however, can only be proven in Gothic architecture at the end of the 15th century, so it's late Gothic, although Villard de Honnecourt was taking steps in this direction in the 13th century already. That's the picture. The architects of the Middle Ages could not cope well with leaps in scale. New projects were often created as a copy of an existing project, of which the floor plan was often simply enlarged. The list of cathedrals that collapsed during construction is long. They were closely observed during construction, and in the event of some kind of deformation, of the appearance of cracks and so on, reinforced as needed. There were always these kinds of concilium where the builders met and discussed the buildings. One finds here a constant of medieval building practice, a purely very empirical step-by-step procedure of algorithmic thought based on tabular traditions with an almost artificial memory, but on the other hand, always in search of new technical solutions. But without theory, without abstraction, or without planning, in the sense of a forward concept into the future, it is hardly possible to ask the right questions. Once it has been understood that a great deal can be achieved with the abstraction of geometry, it becomes more obvious to transcend the limitations that emerge in each case, as was previously the case with the gnomon. By combining the two schemata of ground plan and frontal view into a coherent system of planning and into a coherent geometrical system, a new form of geometric representation can emerge. First of all, Alberti says, I draw a rectangular square of any size on the surface to be painted. I assume that it is an open window through which I look at what is to be painted here. And I'm showing this just as an example. Alberti describes his construction of perspective space in these words. This new space immediately serves another purpose, not planning, but above all, the social role of architecture. For Alberti, the perspective is the prerequisite to provide for an action. An historia, to provide su luogo for an action, its frame, space, and place. This should not just be a container, but also have dramaturgical qualities. The construction of perspective is the necessary prerequisite for an event to unfold there. At the same time, certain objects are then excluded with this mode of representation. Hubert Damisch notices that such a perspective shall have only knowledge of those things it can set within its order, things which occupy a place and whose contour can be defined by a line. The first modern perspective, which it's one of its inventors, Brunelleschi, used with the help of his tavoletta, a small panel, is a theoretical demonstration. It shows that the vanishing point coincides with the point of view. Brunelleschi will not portray heaven, but show it by means of a mirror, a clear limitation of the construction to its possibilities. For what the mirror shows is what the geometric means cannot cover. The sky occupies no place, it has no measure. And as far as clouds are concerned, they do not allow for fixed contours, nor for their forms to be examined with regard to their surfaces. The cloud belongs to the bodies without surface, as Leonardo will write later. Bodies that have neither a precise form nor extremities and whose boundaries penetrate each other. Clouds cannot be captured by this method of perspective, but Leonardo will still deal with them to get closer to nature and to combine in the paintings quantities with qualities. First to clouds, then architecture. As Robin Evans writes, the classic building was actually symmetric. An ideal center line represented as much the plane of symmetry as the plane of the most advantageous section, which does not just lead through a cavity, because it makes little sense otherwise, but also runs through the apex of a vault. This line then corresponds to the developmental axis of the building, which is manifested on the main facade by the centrally placed main entrance. Think, for instance, of the Karlskirche. For the representation of such a building, more or less 3 drawings were enough. In 1963, has no main facade. It is neither rectangular nor symmetrical, nor does it have a main axis. It was mostly designed with models and with sketches. The usual drawings were supplemented by large-scale sections which covered the entire building at close intervals in order to gain a reliable overview and control of the project. Although the 2 published sections through the auditorium provided a fair description of the interior, they were insufficient to describe the geometry of its beveled and curved surfaces more precisely. For the execution, the traditional cut was compressed to such an extent that in fact a profile was created with which the building was cut into thin slices. Perhaps this was a short-sighted approach, less tied to experience than the classical cut, and anything but economic. Nor was it suitable for describing the geometric properties of the outer skin. Nevertheless, this building embodies a fundamental virtue of architecture. It is not conformity to the available means that distinguishes it, not appropriateness, but rather exuberance and excess, the transgression of what Serres calls the gnomon. This architecture was ahead of its plans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristian, for these deep insights. Now we'll go directly to the questions.
If there are any.
Anyone got a question for Kristian?
Thank you very much for the comparisons or the analogy from the gnomon to the way how architecture is conceived and constructed. Do you see any analogies to how, in terms of the pole and the shadow and the way how architecture, as you showed us in terms of historical development, started to more and more engage plan and section and elevation? Do you see analogies that one could exploit in order to talk about this notion of the artificial intelligence that you talked about in the title?
Well, the shadow of the height of the pyramid is measured with the shadow of the pole, and so it's in the Greek examples. There's always this idea that these two kinds of thing, the horizontal and the vertical, are somehow connected together. I was mostly astonished by the idea that this did not exist in architecture until the Renaissance, where those were put together. If for further connections, I would have to think about, yeah.
With this last building, you show that once a project, for example, transgresses the gnomon, in this case the section, and the section is no longer enough to show what the building is really like, these kinds of projects kind of force artificial intelligence to develop further, do they not? And is there a kind of correlation? There's a project and that techniques are no longer sufficient to describe the project, and so the project kind of drives artificial intelligence forward.
Well, I would agree with that, yes. So this project definitely put the existing means of representation to their limits. And it was that was the big challenge of this project they couldn't be to be realized. Yes, but it certainly, buildings like these certainly drive also the development of new instruments and tools.
Thank you.
One more question. If not, then we would make a break. Then we would make a break for 5 minutes.